The words, when Isabella finally spoke them, were delivered with a chillingly casual air, as if she were discussing the weather or a change in dinner plans, not detonating a 22-year marriage. We were in the kitchen, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the newly refinished oak floors. The final mortgage payment on our house, the one we'd meticulously chipped away at for 2 decades, had cleared the bank just 3 days prior. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. "Samuel," she began, turning from the window, where she'd been observing the hydrangeas, "I think it's time we went our separate ways. I want a divorce. My name is Samuel Croft, 52 years old, and for the last 30 years, I've worked as a forensic financial auditor. My life is a landscape of ledgers, spreadsheets, and the painstaking reconstruction of financial narratives, often uncovering deceit hidden within layers of carefully constructed falsehoods. I find a certain solace in numbers, in their irrefutable logic, their inability to lie unless deliberately manipulated." Isabella's announcement, though delivered with the nonchalance of a seasoned stage performer, did not entirely surprise me. The data points, the subtle anomalies in her behavior, had been accumulating for years, forming a discernible, if unwelcome, pattern. I continued stirring the risotto I was preparing for dinner, the rhythmic motion a counterpoint to the sudden turbulence in the room. "I see," I said, my voice even, betraying none of the complex calculations already running through my mind. "Is there a particular reason for this decision, Isabella, especially now, after we've just achieved a significant financial milestone together?" She waved a dismissive hand, the diamond on her finger, a 10th anniversary gift, catching the light. "Oh, Samuel, don't be so pragmatic. It's not about the mortgage, not really. It's about personal growth. I need space to find myself, to pursue my own path. We've grown apart. Surely you felt it too." I had indeed felt it, though I'd attributed her increasing detachment to other factors. Her new circle of wellness friends, her sudden passion for expensive spiritual retreats, her frequent pronouncements about living her truth, a truth that seemed to require an ever-increasing budget. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly fathom, was the extent of my own quiet observations, the meticulous mental and actual archive I had been compiling. She saw me as predictable, perhaps a little dull, a man whose world revolved around the comforting certainty of numbers. She had no idea that those numbers, and the patterns they revealed, had painted a very clear picture of her intentions long before she voiced them. And she certainly had no idea about the recordings. The small, discrete audio device, legally activated in our shared living spaces within our one-party consent state, had been my silent confidant for the past 18 months, capturing a narrative she believed was entirely private. "The house, of course, will need to be settled," she continued, her tone now a little more businesslike, the feigned wistfulness receding. "Given that it's fully paid off and my contributions to making it a home over the years, I think it's only fair that I retain it. And we'll need to discuss appropriate spousal support. Naturally, my lawyer, Mr. Adler, will be in touch with you or your representative to discuss the particulars." Mr. Adler, a new name, not a lawyer from our long-standing circle of professional acquaintances. This, too, was a significant data point. It suggested a premeditated, aggressive strategy. I spooned a risotto onto 2 plates, my movements unhurried. "Naturally," I echoed, "these matters will require careful consideration. We should both ensure we have competent legal advice." I placed her plate before her. She looked at it, then at me, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, in her eyes. Perhaps she had expected an argument, an emotional outburst, a pleading. My calmness seemed to unnerve her more than any display of anger would have. "Well, I'm glad you're being so reasonable about this, Samuel," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "It makes things so much easier." Easier for whom, I wondered. As we ate in a silence thick with unspoken words, my mind was already processing, strategizing. The recordings, securely stored and backed up, detailed numerous conversations Isabella had had with her friend Brenda, outlining her plan with startling clarity. Wait until the mortgage was paid, secure the house, and then leverage my perceived desire to avoid a messy public dispute to extract a generous, ongoing financial settlement. It's only fair, Bryn. Her voice, captured with digital precision, had chirped just last week. I've put in the years, and Samuel just wants a quiet life. He'll pay to make it go away. The house, free and clear, is the least I deserve for my emotional labor. Emotional labor, another phrase from her wellness lexicon. It seemed her primary emotional labor had been patiently waiting for the final mortgage payment to clear. What Isabella had failed to account for in her calculations was my profession. A forensic auditor doesn't just accept the surface narrative. We dig, we verify, we cross-reference. We look for the underlying truth, the story the numbers and the evidence truly tell. And the evidence I possessed painted a very different picture of fairness and entitlement. She thought she was closing a chapter and cashing out. She had no idea I was about to open a meticulously documented appendix, one that would fundamentally alter the historical record of our dissolution. The risotto was excellent, if I did say so myself. I wondered if Mr. Adler enjoyed Italian food. He would soon be receiving a rather indigestible serving of truth, carefully prepared by yours truly. Our early years together, viewed now through the clarifying lens of impending divorce, seemed almost like a different lifetime, an archived file from a forgotten era. Isabella had been vibrant then, a junior marketing executive with a quick laugh and an infectious energy that had drawn me out of my naturally reserved shell. We met at a charity auction, both bidding, rather comically, on the same slightly damaged antique globe. I'd let her win, and she'd insisted on buying me dinner as a thank you. That dinner had led to another, and then another, comfortable rhythm establishing itself between us. I was already well into my career as a forensic auditor, a profession that, while lucrative, rarely made for sparkling dinner party conversation. Isabella, however, had seemed fascinated, or at least she'd feigned fascination convincingly. "It's like being a detective, but with numbers," she'd exclaimed, her eyes wide. "You uncover all the secrets." At the time, I'd found her enthusiasm charming. We married 2 years later, a modest ceremony, followed by the purchase of the house that was now the focal point of her exit strategy. It had been a fixer-upper, and we'd poured our weekends into it, sanding floors, painting walls, planting the garden that Isabella now considered solely her creation. My contribution, the steady financial underpinning and the meticulous project management of renovations, seemed to have faded from her memory. The first decade was, by most measures, a good one. We traveled, we entertained, we built a life. I rose through the ranks of my firm, my reputation for unearthing complex financial deceptions growing with each successful case. Isabella's career, however, seemed to stall. She moved from one marketing role to another, never quite finding her niche, her initial spark gradually dimming into a kind of restless dissatisfaction. The shift, the first truly noticeable data anomaly, occurred around her 40th birthday. That was when the wellness phase began. It started innocuously enough, yoga classes, a new interest in organic foods. But it soon escalated. There were expensive retreats with vaguely defined spiritual gurus, workshops on manifesting abundance, an abundance that seemed to require significant upfront investment, and a new circle of friends who spoke a language of affirmations and cosmic energies that I found utterly bewildering. Isabella began to talk less about her marketing career and more about her journey of self-discovery. She'd returned from these retreats with a temporary, almost manic glow, full of pronouncements about living authentically and releasing negative energies that I slowly began to realize often seemed to include me and the perceived constraints of our conventional life. Her interest in our finances, previously non-existent, took on a new, specific focus. It wasn't about understanding investments or planning for retirement. It was about liquidity, about access. "Samuel, that big bonus you got last year," she'd ask, her tone casual, "is it just sitting in some boring account? Or could we use it for something more expansive?" Her expansive ideas usually involve funding a friend's dubious startup, selling or infused jewelry, or investing in a transformational healing center run by a guru whose primary qualification seemed to be a very white set of teeth and an ability to speak in vague platitudes for hours on end. I, the pragmatic auditor, had gently but firmly steered our finances away from such ventures, a stance she increasingly framed as me stifling her potential or not supporting her growth. It was around this time, about 3 years ago, that the mortgage became a recurring theme in her conversations. "Wouldn't it be wonderful, Samuel, to have the house completely ours? To be free of that debt," she'd muse, often after returning from a particularly expensive retreat. "Think of the freedom it would give us." Or, more accurately, I now understood the freedom it would give her. My suspicions, initially just a vague unease, began to solidify. Her detachment grew. Our conversations became perfunctory. The shared intimacy that had once defined our marriage dwindled, replaced by a polite, roommate-like coexistence. It was the increasing frequency of her hushed phone calls with her friend Brenda, often conducted in the garden or the guest room with the door closed, that finally prompted me to take a more proactive approach to data collection. Brenda was a recent addition to Isabella's circle, a fellow devotee of the wellness circuit, twice divorced, and from what I could gather, living very comfortably on alimony from her previous, very wealthy husbands. She seemed to be Isabella's primary confidant and, I suspected, her strategic advisor in matters of personal liberation. I am not a man prone to casual snooping. My profession demands an unwavering adherence to ethics and legality. However, our state operated under one-party consent for audio recordings, meaning if one participant in a conversation was aware of the recording, it was permissible. And as a co-owner of the house, the common areas were spaces where I had a reasonable expectation of overhearing conversations. After one particularly furtive call Isabella had with Brenda, during which I'd overheard snippets about timing and asset evaluation, I made a decision. I purchased a small, high-quality audio recorder, voice-activated, with a long battery life. I placed it discreetly in the living room, amongst a collection of old books on a high shelf, a room where Isabella often took her calls. It felt like a betrayal of sorts, a step into a realm of marital espionage I never thought I'd inhabit. But the alternative, to remain passively ignorant while my life was potentially being dismantled around me, was unacceptable to an auditor. The first few weeks yielded nothing but hours of mundane chatter, television noise, and Isabella's increasingly frequent calls to her various wellness gurus. Then about 18 months ago, the recordings began to capture something more specific. Conversations with Brenda, at first veiled, then increasingly explicit about her dissatisfaction, her desire for a fresh start, and, most damningly, her plan. The plan to wait. To wait until the mortgage, that final financial tether, was severed. Then, and only then, to make her move. Each recorded conversation was a new entry in my private, devastating archive. Each word a confirmation of a narrative I had begun to suspect. Isabella wasn't just growing apart from me. She was methodically plotting her exit strategy, with our paid-off home as the centerpiece of her severance package. The forensic auditor in me was grimly satisfied with the clarity of the evidence. The husband was heartbroken, but even heartbreak, I've learned, can be meticulously documented and eventually archived. The 18 months leading up to Isabella's divorce announcement were a masterclass in dissimulation, both hers and, I reluctantly admit, my own. While she perfected her role as the spiritually evolving wife on the cusp of a magnificent, albeit vaguely defined, personal breakthrough, I honed my skills as the quietly observant, seemingly oblivious husband. The audio recordings continued to accumulate, a secret soundtrack to the slow-motion demolition of our marriage. Isabella, emboldened by her perceived impunity and Brenda's enthusiastic coaching, became increasingly candid in her recorded conversations. There were discussions about lawyers. Brenda had recommended a real shark, a Mr. Adler who specialized in getting women what they truly deserve. There were detailed analyses of my presumed income and assets, often wildly overestimated, fueled by Brenda's anecdata from her own lucrative divorces. He's got to have a fortune stashed away. Izzy, Brenda's voice, tinny but clear on the recording, would insist. These quiet, boring types always do. They're like squirrels with their nuts. You just have to know where to dig. Isabella would giggle. Then her tone would turn serious. The house is key, Bren. Once that mortgage is gone, it's our biggest asset, free and clear. Adler said that makes a huge difference in the settlement. He said to be patient, wait for that final payment, then act decisively. Act decisively. It had a chillingly corporate ring to it. My own preparations became more focused. I ensured all my personal financial records, particularly those predating our marriage and detailing my inherited assets, were impeccably organized and securely stored off-site. The Alastair Finch Preservation Trust, established years ago with the help of my solicitor, Ms. Holloway, became an even more critical component of my long-term strategy. Ms. Holloway, a woman of formidable intellect and equally formidable discretion, was already aware of the broad strokes of my marital situation, though I hadn't yet revealed the existence of the recordings. Our previous consultations had been framed as prudent estate planning, but she was astute enough to read between the lines. I also began to subtly disentangle some of our more intertwined finances where legally and ethically possible, always ensuring transparency on paper, but creating clearer delineations that would be easier to address in a potential settlement. Isabella, lost in her world of affirmations and aspirational Pinterest boards for her future life, noticed none of this. Her focus was singular: the mortgage payoff date. She started a countdown calendar, framed as a mutual celebration of our impending debt freedom. Each X she drew through a passing day felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. The irony was almost too much to bear. She celebrated each milestone payment with increasing enthusiasm, while I, listening to her gleeful late-night calls with Brenda, felt a hardening resolve. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about a calculated attempt at financial exploitation, and I would not allow my life's work, my carefully managed security, to be plundered due to her greed and Brenda's predatory advice. I even began to document Isabella's expenditures from her empowerment fund, which I still contributed to, albeit with a growing sense of her spending was eclectic. Expensive yoga retreats, designer athleisure, where consultations with aura readers, and surprisingly large donations to Zephyr's Global Awakening Institute. There was little evidence of any actual investment in a viable business or personal development that didn't involve a hefty price tag and vague promises of spiritual enlightenment. This, too, went into the archive. Evidence not of her contribution to our marital wealth, but of her systematic draining of it for frivolous pursuits. The final mortgage payment itself was an exercise in surrealism. Isabella insisted on a small celebration, just the two of us, with champagne and a catered dinner. She raised her glass, her eyes shining. To us, Samuel. To freedom. To new beginnings. I clinked my glass against hers. Indeed, Isabella. To new beginnings. The duplicity was suffocating, but I maintained my composure. The forensic auditor always waits for all the evidence to be presented before drawing conclusions, or in this case, before revealing them. 3 days later, as predicted by the recordings, she made her announcement. The timing was impeccable, almost to the hour that Brenda had advised on one of the tapes. Don't let him get too comfortable in his debt-free bliss, Izzy. Strike while the iron is hot, and his guard is down. Her guard, however, was the one that had been fatally compromised. She assumed I was the same predictable, slightly befuddled Samuel she had always known, a man easily managed, easily guilt. She had no concept of the Samuel who had spent years listening to her plans, documenting her deceptions, and quietly preparing his own unassailable defense. The arrival of Mr. Adler's initial letter, demanding, as Isabella had foreshadowed, the house, substantial spousal support, and a swift, uncontested settlement in her favor, was almost a relief. The charade was over. The battle lines, long drawn in secret, were now officially in the open. I immediately contacted Ms. Holloway. "Eleanor," I said, using her first name as we did in our more informal professional dealings, "the anticipated event has occurred. Isabella has requested a divorce, and her legal counsel has made initial contact. I believe it's time we reviewed the supplementary audio archive I've been compiling." There was a brief pause on her end. "Supplementary audio archive. Samuel, you continue to exceed my expectations for thoroughness. Send it over. I'll clear my afternoon." This, I suspect, is going to be rather illuminating. Illuminating was an understatement. The recordings were a masterclass in premeditated marital asset acquisition. Ms. Holloway, after listening to a curated selection of the most damning conversations, was uncharacteristically silent for a moment. Then a slow, appreciative chuckle. "Samuel," she finally said, "Isabella and her Mr. Adler are in for a rather abrupt reevaluation of their negotiating position. This isn't just evidence, it's a narrative. And it's not the one they think they're writing." The game was now truly in play, and I held all the high cards, meticulously cataloged and ready for presentation. The first official communication from Mr. Adler, Isabella's chosen legal gladiator, was a masterpiece of presumptive aggression. It painted a picture of Isabella as the long-suffering, emotionally neglected spouse who had sacrificed her own ambitions for the sake of our marriage and was now entitled to the lion's share of our assets as just compensation. The house, naturally, was non-negotiable. The spousal support figures quoted were eye-watering, clearly based on Brenda's inflated assessment of my stashed-away fortune. Ms. Holloway reviewed the letter with a raised eyebrow. "Ambitious," she remarked dryly, "and remarkably devoid of any factual basis regarding your actual financial structure, Samuel. They're operating on pure assumption and, I suspect, a healthy dose of wishful thinking." Our initial response, drafted by Ms. Holloway, was a model of calm, professional restraint. It acknowledged receipt of their letter, stated my willingness to engage in good faith negotiations for an equitable settlement, and requested full financial disclosure from Isabella, including details of her empowerment fund and any income derived from her wellness ventures. We made no mention of the recordings, no hint of the arsenal we held in reserve. "Let them build their case on sand, Samuel," Ms. Holloway advised. "The higher they build it, the more spectacular its collapse will be when we introduce the bedrock of your evidence." The next few weeks were a flurry of legal correspondence. Mr. Adler sent over Isabella's financial disclosure. It was, as expected, a work of creative accounting. Her empowerment fund was presented as a series of personal loans from me, with no expectation of repayment. Her expenditures on retreats and gurus were framed as investments in personal development essential for her future earning capacity. Her income was listed as zero, her future prospects dependent entirely on a generous settlement. My own disclosure, by contrast, was a paragon of clarity, detailed statements from all accounts, including the Alastair Finch Preservation Trust, with clear documentation of provenance for all assets held within it. We included a summary of my regular contributions to Isabella's empowerment fund, meticulously logged with dates and amounts. Mr. Adler's response to our disclosure was one of indignant disbelief. He accused me of hiding assets, of fraudulent conveyance into the trust, of deliberately undervaluing marital property. He demanded an independent forensic audit of my finances, a threat that Ms. Holloway met with polite amusement. "By all means, Mr. Adler," she replied in writing. "We welcome a thorough review by any qualified professional. My client's records are impeccable. Perhaps your client would be willing to subject her own wellness venture expenditures to similar scrutiny." The first mediation session was scheduled. Isabella arrived looking confident, dressed in an expensive new suit that screamed empowered businesswoman about to secure her financial independence. Mr. Adler, a portly man with a booming voice and an air of unshakable self-importance, immediately went on the offensive, reiterating their demands for the house, the inflated spousal support, and a significant portion of what he termed my hidden investment portfolio. I remained silent for the most part, allowing Ms. Holloway to parry his thrusts with calm, factual counterarguments. She pointed to the clear documentation of the trust's premarital and inherited origins. She highlighted my consistent financial support of Isabella throughout the marriage, including the funding of her numerous and conspicuously unprofitable ventures. She questioned the basis for the exorbitant spousal support demand, given Isabella's stated ambition to launch a successful wellness brand. Isabella sat beside Adler, nodding approvingly at his aggressive pronouncements, occasionally interjecting with a sigh about her sacrifices or her need for security after all these years. She seemed to genuinely believe her own narrative, or at least the narrative Brenda and Adler had constructed for her. The mediator, a retired judge named Harrison, listened patiently, his expression unreadable. After nearly 2 hours of Adler's bluster and Isabella's rehearsed victimhood, Judge Harrison finally turned to Ms. Holloway. Ms. Holloway, your client has been remarkably quiet. Do you have a response to Mr. Adler's assertions, particularly regarding the alleged undervaluation of marital assets and the claim that Mrs. Croft was unaware of your client's financial arrangements? Ms. Holloway smiled faintly. Indeed, Your Honor. We believe there may be some contextual information that Mr. Adler and his client are not currently privy to. Information that might significantly reframe their understanding of Mrs. Croft's motivations and expectations regarding this divorce. Adler scoffed. Contextual information? Are we talking about Mr. Croft's sudden recollection of a forgotten offshore account? Because my client is prepared for such eventualities. Not quite, Mr. Adler, Ms. Holloway said, her voice dropping slightly, acquiring a new edge of steel. We're talking about Mrs. Croft's own words, her own plans, discussed at length and with considerable enthusiasm with her close friend, Ms. Brenda Reynolds, over a period of approximately 18 months. Isabella froze. Her eyes darted towards Adler, then back to Ms. Holloway, a flicker of unease, then outright panic beginning to dawn. Adler looked momentarily confused. Brenda Reynolds? What does she have to do with anything? Ms. Reynolds, it appears, served as a strategic advisor to Mrs. Croft. Ms. Holloway continued, opening a file. Advising her, for instance, on the optimal timing for initiating divorce proceedings, specifically after the marital home's mortgage was fully discharged. Advising her on legal representation, on asset evaluation, and on the best way to secure, and I quote, the house free and clear as the least she deserved for her emotional labor. The color drained from Isabella's face. Adler was now looking at his client with a new, sharp scrutiny. The air in the mediation room, once thick with Adler's bombast, was suddenly charged with a different kind of underscore tension. The carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The archivist's moment was approaching. Mr. Adler, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He recognized the shift in the room's atmosphere, the sudden pallor of his client, the quiet confidence emanating from Ms. Holloway. I'm not sure I understand the relevance of hearsay conversations with a third party, Ms. Holloway, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier boom. Unless you have Ms. Reynolds here to testify, which I doubt. Oh, we have something far more direct than hearsay, Mr. Adler, Ms. Holloway replied, her gaze unwavering. We have recordings. Voice-activated, legally obtained audio recordings of numerous conversations between Mrs. Croft and Ms. Reynolds, conducted within the marital home, where my client, Mr. Croft, was also resident and thus a party to the consent laws of this state. These recordings detail, in Mrs. Croft's own voice, her premeditated plan to initiate this divorce immediately following the mortgage payoff, her explicit intent to secure the entirety of the unencumbered marital home, and her strategies for maximizing her financial settlement based on what can only be described as a deliberate exploitation of Mr. Croft's perceived desire for a quiet, uncontested separation. She paused, allowing the full weight of her statement to land. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a small, choked sound from Isabella. Judge Harrison, the mediator, leaned forward, his expression now one of intense interest. Recordings, Miss Holloway? Indeed, Your Honor, she affirmed. Approximately 72 hours of relevant audio, meticulously logged and transcribed by my client, whose professional expertise in forensic analysis, as you may know, is considerable. We have prepared a summary transcript of the most pertinent exchanges, should Mr. Adler and his client wish to review it. Or, of course, we can arrange for them to listen to the original audio, though it might be a rather lengthy and uncomfortable experience for Mrs. Croft. Isabella looked as if she might faint. Her carefully constructed narrative of the wronged wife, the spiritual seeker needing resources to fly free, was disintegrating before her very eyes. Mr. Adler stared at Isabella, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning fury. He had clearly been operating under a completely different set of assumptions fed to him by his client. "Is this true, Isabella?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Did you discuss your divorce strategy with Brenda Reynolds, and were you recorded?" Isabella could only nod, tears welling in her eyes. Not tears of remorse, I suspected, but tears of humiliation and the terror of exposure. This is an outrage," Adler spluttered, turning back to Ms. Holloway. "An invasion of privacy. This evidence is inadmissible." "I can assure you, Mr. Adler," Ms. Holloway said calmly, "that the recordings were obtained in full compliance with state law. Mr. Croft, as a resident and co-owner of the home, had every right to record conversations in common areas, especially when he had reasonable grounds to suspect that actions detrimental to his financial and personal well-being were being planned. His foresight in this matter, while unfortunate in its necessity, is now critical to achieving a truly equitable settlement." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Adler, while the ethics of such recordings in a marital context can be debated, Ms. Holloway is correct regarding the legal admissibility in this state under the circumstances she describes. I would strongly advise you and your client to review the summary transcript Ms. Holloway is offering. It may significantly impact your assessment of this case and your client's claims." Adler, looking thoroughly deflated, reluctantly accepted the slim file Ms. Holloway extended. He and Isabella huddled together at their end of the table, whispering furiously as they began to read. I watched them, my expression neutral. There was no triumph in this moment, only a grim affirmation of what I had known for months. The truth, meticulously archived, was now having its say. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as they read. Isabella's face went from pale to ashen. Adler's brow furrowed deeper with each turned page. I could almost pinpoint the moment they reached the excerpts where Isabella and Brenda discussed her plans to play the victim card, and how Samuel was too predictable and would cave easily to avoid a scene. Finally, Adler closed the file with a snap. He looked not at Miss Holloway, but directly at me. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier arrogance, "it appears my client may have been less than forthcoming regarding certain pre-divorce planning activities." "Indeed, Mr. Adler," I replied quietly. "Full disclosure, as you know, is paramount in these proceedings." On all sides, Ms. Holloway then gently interjected. "Given this new information, Your Honor, Mr. Adler, perhaps we can now discuss a settlement that more accurately reflects the true contributions and intentions of both parties, and one that acknowledges the significant financial planning and separate assets maintained by Mr. Croft, including the Alastair Finch Preservation Trust, which, as you will see from our full disclosure, predates any discussions of divorce by many years and was established for legitimate estate planning purposes with." Mrs. Croft signed acknowledgement at the time. The landscape of the mediation had irrevocably shifted. The power dynamic had inverted. Isabella's aggressive claim had been exposed as a calculated gamble based on a false premise: my ignorance and my presumed passivity. The recordings had not just revealed her plan, they had revealed her character. And that, more than any financial figure, was the most damning evidence of all. The archivist had successfully defended his collection from an attempt at illicit acquisition, using the antagonist's own words as the most effective deterrent. The meticulous record had prevailed. The remainder of the mediation session, and indeed the subsequent weeks of negotiation, were conducted in a vastly different atmosphere. Mr. Adler, his initial bombast replaced by a grudging professionalism, recognized the untenable position his client was now in. The summary transcript of the recordings, which Ms. Holloway had judiciously shared, had effectively dismantled Isabella's narrative of the wronged, deserving spouse. Her claims of emotional labor and sacrificed ambitions rang hollow against the backdrop of her own voice coolly strategizing her financial exit from our marriage, timed perfectly with the mortgage payoff. The focus shifted from Isabella's exorbitant demands to a more realistic assessment of marital assets and equitable division. The Alastair Finch Preservation Trust, with its clear documentation of premarital and inherited funds, was quickly acknowledged as separate property, untouchable. Ms. Holloway was firm on this, and Mr. Adler, having seen the strength of our overall position, did not waste much time arguing the point. The primary asset for division was, as Isabella had correctly identified, the marital home, now unencumbered. However, her plan to retain it outright was no longer a viable option. Ms. Holloway proposed a straightforward solution. The house would be sold and the net proceeds divided, but not a simple 50-50 split of the total value. Instead, she argued for a division that took into account my significant down payment from premarital assets and the fact that the accelerated mortgage payments made in the final years had come predominantly from my income, while Isabella was channeling her empowerment fund into Zephyr's coffers and her own aspirational spending. The recordings, while not directly about these specific financial contributions, had so thoroughly damaged Isabella's credibility that her claims of equal contribution to the home's equity were significantly weakened. She could no longer convincingly portray herself as a partner who had diligently built wealth alongside me. Instead, she appeared as someone who had patiently waited for an asset to mature before attempting to claim it. Isabella, during these negotiations, was a shadow of her former confident self. She was quiet, subdued, often deferring to Mr. Adler, her eyes frequently red-rimmed. The vibrant, empowered woman who had breezed back from Sedona was gone, replaced by someone facing the stark consequences of her miscalculations. There were moments, I'll admit, where a fleeting sense of pity pricked at me. 22 years was a long time, and the end, however justified, was still the end of a significant chapter. But pity could not be allowed to cloud judgment. The forensic auditor in me knew that sentimentality had no place in a factual assessment of assets and liabilities, especially when one party had demonstrated such clear intent to exploit. The spousal support issue also underwent a dramatic revision. Mr. Adler's initial demands for a lifetime of generous payments were quickly abandoned. Given Isabella's own recorded statements about her plans to launch a supposedly lucrative wellness brand, and her relatively young age and good health, Ms. Holloway argued for a short period of transitional support, if any, designed to allow her to genuinely establish herself, not to fund an indefinite period of self-discovery at my expense. The existence of the recordings and Isabella's clear articulation of her future earning potential to Brenda made it difficult for Adler to argue she was incapable of self-support. Brenda Reynolds, incidentally, seemed to have vanished from Isabella's life almost as quickly as Mr. Adler's initial confidence. Once the recordings were mentioned, I imagine Isabella had some rather pointed conversations with her strategic advisor. It's often the case that architects of failed plans prefer to distance themselves from the wreckage. After several weeks of back and forth, a final settlement was reached. The house would be sold, with the proceeds divided according to a formula that acknowledged my initial investment and the disproportionate contribution to the mortgage in recent years. I would receive approximately 65% of the net proceeds. Isabella would receive transitional spousal support for a period of 2 years at a modest, realistic figure. She would retain the contents of her empowerment fund, what was left of it after Zephyr and her Sedona retreats, and her personal belongings. All other assets, including the entirety of the Preservation Trust, remained mine. It was, by any objective measure, a fair settlement, given the circumstances. It was certainly a far cry from the windfall Isabella had envisioned in her recorded conversations with Brenda. Signing the final divorce decree felt less like a moment of victory and more like the meticulous closing of a problematic archival file. The record was now complete, the provenance clear, the disposition final. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my diligence, my anachronistic habit of careful record-keeping, and yes, the unfortunate necessity of the recordings, had ensured a just outcome. Isabella, I heard later, did not launch her wellness brand. The seed capital she received from the house sale was significantly less than her projections, and her enthusiasm for the venture seemed to have waned along with her financial prospects. Last I heard, she had moved to a smaller town to live with her sister for a while, presumably to reassess her path, and perhaps to learn that living her truth sometimes involved facing uncomfortable financial realities. As for me, the forensic auditor, I continued my work, finding a certain ironic comfort in the daily pursuit of truth within the complex, often deceptive, world of numbers. My personal life, now streamlined and unencumbered by false narratives, felt lighter, more authentic. The house, once a symbol of shared dreams and then a target of calculated greed, was sold. I found a smaller, more manageable condominium overlooking the river, a place with clean lines and ample space for my books and my thoughts. The quiet hum of the city replaced the strained silences of a dying marriage. The recordings? They were securely archived, a permanent record of a chapter one would not forget, but one I no longer needed to dwell upon. Some archives are preserved not for frequent review, but as a testament to lessons learned, a reminder that even in the most personal of narratives, the underlying data, if carefully collected and analyzed, will always reveal the truth. And the truth, as they say, has a way of setting one free, or, in Isabella's case, setting one's wildly inflated expectations significantly lower. The sale of the house was finalized 3 months after the divorce decree. It was a strange experience, walking through those empty rooms for the last time, rooms that held over 2 decades of memories, both good and, more recently, deeply unsettling. The silence was profound, no longer the strained quiet of unspoken resentments, but the neutral emptiness of a space preparing for new occupants, new narratives. I ensured the new owners received a complete file of all maintenance records and renovation details, an archivist's habit I couldn't quite shake. They seemed appreciative, if a little bemused by the meticulous detail. My new condominium, though smaller, felt expansive in its simplicity. I had downsized considerably, keeping only the things that held genuine meaning or utility. The process of sorting through years of accumulated possessions was, in itself, a form of emotional auditing, a letting go of a past that no longer served me. I set up my study with its view of the river, my books arranged by subject, and then alphabetically by author, my financial records, both personal and professional, stored in their usual, impeccably organized fashion. Life settled into a new rhythm. Work provided its familiar challenges and satisfactions. My colleagues at the auditing firm, who had only known that I was going through a difficult divorce, remarked on my seemingly unruffled demeanor. They didn't know, of course, about the secret archive of recordings, about the meticulous behind-the-scenes battle I had fought and won, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unassailable power of evidence. Ms. Holloway and I had lunch occasionally. She was always keen to hear if I'd encountered any new archival anomalies in my professional life. "You've spoiled me, Samuel," she once joked. Now, whenever I have a client with a complex financial dispute, I secretly wish they'd come armed with 18 months of perfectly transcribed audio recordings. It does streamline the discovery process considerably. I never heard directly from Isabella again. The transitional spousal support payments were made through our respective lawyers, a buffer that suited me well. I did hear, through a mutual acquaintance who had bumped into Isabella's friend Brenda at some social function, that Brenda was now advising a new set of clients on how to achieve financial liberation through divorce. Some people, it seemed, never updated their operating systems. My own liberation was of a different sort. It was the freedom that comes from shedding a burdensome, duplicitous relationship, the peace that comes from knowing you acted with integrity even when faced with deceit. It was the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed plan, a strategy that had protected what was rightfully mine. I found I had more time, more mental energy. I reconnected with old friends, pursued hobbies I'd neglected, chess, long-distance cycling, attending lectures on obscure historical topics. I even started volunteering at a local museum, helping them organize their collection of historical maps, a task that brought me a surprising amount of joy. It was, in a way, a return to my core passion, bringing order to chaos, preserving the past, making sense of disparate pieces of information to form a coherent whole. One evening, about a year after the divorce, I was reviewing my investment portfolio, the Alastair Finch Preservation Trust continuing its steady, unexciting growth, when I came across the file related to the house sale. I looked at the final settlement figures, at the clear delineation of assets. There was no lingering bitterness, no sense of triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter definitively closed, a financial audit successfully completed. The recordings, I knew, were still stored securely, backed up in multiple locations, a digital artifact of a painful period. But I had no desire to listen to them again. Their purpose had been served. They were now simply part of the historical record, a testament to a time when vigilance had been a necessary, if unwelcome, companion. My life, once a shared document, was now solely my own to author. And I found that I preferred the clarity and precision of a single, well-edited narrative. The quiet hum of my computer, the gentle lapping of the river outside my window, the ordered rows of books on my shelves. These were the new soundtrack, the new architecture of my days. And it was, in its own way, a profoundly satisfying composition. The greatest asset, I had come to realize, was not wealth itself, but the peace of mind that comes from knowing your foundations are secure, your records are clear, and your truth is unassailable. And that was an archive I intended to protect with unwavering diligence for all the years to come. Several years passed, and the sharp edges of the divorce, once so clearly defined, began to soften with the passage of time, much like an old photograph whose contrasts gently fade. My life continued on its steady, ordered course. I eventually retired from the auditing firm, though I still took on occasional consulting projects, intricate financial puzzles that kept my mind engaged. My volunteer work at the museum expanded. I found myself curating small exhibitions, a task that combined my love for history with my innate organizational skills. The condominium by the river remained my sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection. One afternoon, while browsing in a used bookstore, a favorite haunt, I quite literally bumped into Isabella. It was a jarring moment, an unexpected collision of past and present. She looked older, lines etched around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. Her vibrant, expensive clothing had been replaced by something more subdued, almost plain. She was carrying a stack of art history books. "Samuel," she exclaimed, genuine surprise in her voice. A few of her books tumbled to the floor. We both stooped to pick them up, a brief, awkward moment of shared activity. "Isabella," I said, acknowledging her. "It's been a while." "Yes, it has," she replied, her smile hesitant. "You're looking well. And you, Isabella." She clutched her books. I'm taking some courses at the community college. Art history. And I'm teaching a children's pottery class on weekends." There was a humility in her tone I'd never heard before. "That sounds fulfilling," I offered, searching for a neutral response. "It is actually," she said, a flicker of her old spark returning, but softer now, less forced. "It's not exactly the wellness empire I once envisioned," she added, with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "But it's real, and it's mine." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching, not uncomfortably, but filled with the unsaid history between us. "Well," she said finally, "it was good to see you, Samuel. And you, Isabella. Take care." She nodded and moved towards the checkout counter. I watched her go, a strange mix of emotions stirring within me. Not anger, not resentment, those had long since been archived. Perhaps a faint, distant sadness for the years we had shared, for the potential that had been squandered, not just by our actions, but by the slow, imperceptible drift of two people onto different paths. But mostly, I felt a sense of completion. The final, unexpected entry in a long-closed file. Her life, it seemed, had found a new, more modest trajectory, one perhaps more aligned with reality than with the grandiose fantasies peddled by charlatans like Zephyr and amplified by opportunistic friends like Brenda. I paid for my own books, a biography of a forgotten cartographer and a treatise on medieval manuscript illumination, and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The encounter had been brief, almost mundane, yet it felt significant, like finding a missing page that, while not altering the main text, provided a more complete understanding of the entire volume. My own narrative continued. I had built a life of quiet contentment, a life based on principles I valued: integrity, diligence, and the pursuit of knowledge. The storm of the divorce had passed, and the foundations I had so carefully laid had proven strong enough to withstand it. The Alastair Finch Preservation Trust remained a symbol of that foresight, a quiet monument to the importance of preparing for unforeseen contingencies. As I walked home, the city's familiar sound around me, I reflected that life, like any great archive, is not just about preserving the past, but about making space for the future. Some records are closed, their stories complete. Others are still being written, their narratives unfolding with each passing day. And the role of the archivist, whether of historical documents or of one's own life, is to ensure that the collection, in its entirety, tells a true and coherent story. Mine, I felt, was finally doing just that. The quiet satisfaction of a meticulously curated existence, unburdened by deceit, unmarred by unresolved conflicts, was its own reward. And that, I concluded, was an asset more valuable than any ledger could ever quantify. The unexpected encounter with Isabella at the bookstore became a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a long and tumultuous sentence. It didn't reopen old wounds, nor did it inspire any desire for renewed connection. Instead, it served as a gentle reminder of how far I had come and how profoundly different my life was now. The peace I had cultivated was not a fragile thing. It was robust, built on the solid foundations of self-reliance and the hard-won wisdom that comes from navigating betrayal with integrity. My days continued to be filled with the pursuits I enjoyed. The museum work became more involved, and I found myself spearheading a project to digitize a vast collection of local historical photographs, a task that resonated deeply with my archival instincts. It was about preservation, yes, but also about accessibility, about sharing the narratives of the past with a new generation. It felt meaningful, a contribution that extended beyond my own personal sphere. I also began to travel more, not to the expensive, soul-searching retreats that had once captivated Isabella, but at places steeped in history, ancient libraries, forgotten ruins, cities where every cobblestone seemed to whisper stories of bygone eras. These journeys were solitary for the most part, and I found a profound sense of companionship in the silence of old cathedrals and the dusty aisles of centuries-old archives. It was a different kind of wellness, one rooted in knowledge and connection to the vast sweep of human experience, rather than in fleeting affirmations or costly gurus. Occasionally, Ms. Holloway would call with a particularly challenging case she was working on, seeking my unofficial, forensic auditor's perspective on some tangled financial web. These conversations were always intellectually stimulating, a reminder of the skills I had honed over a lifetime, skills that had, in the end, served me so well in my own personal crisis. We never spoke directly of my divorce anymore. It was an understood baseline, a case study in preparedness that needed no further dissection between us. One day, while clearing out a seldom-used drawer in my study, I came across the small, discreet audio recorder that had played such a pivotal role in the unraveling of Isabella's plans. I held it in my hand for a moment, a relic from a past I had meticulously documented, and then, just as meticulously, moved on from. For a fleeting second, I considered listening to one of the old recordings, perhaps out of some detached academic curiosity. But I resisted the urge. There was no need. The data had been collected, analyzed, and had served its purpose. To revisit it now would be akin to deliberately rereading a painful chapter in a book whose ending you already knew and had accepted. I erased the contents of the recorder, reformatted its memory, and placed it in a box of old electronic equipment destined for a recycling center. Its role in my personal archive was complete. Its significance lay not in the sounds it had captured, but in the truth it had helped to reveal and the just resolution it had facilitated. My life was now characterized by a quiet, unostentatious contentment. The drama and deceit of Isabella's final years with me were like a faded exhibit, still part of the museum of my memory, but no longer on prominent display. The main galleries of my mind were now occupied with more current, more edifying collections. The research for my next historical lecture, the plans for my upcoming trip to explore the ancient libraries of Alexandria, the satisfaction of seeing a young archivist I was mentoring make a significant discovery in the museum's collection. The best revenge, if one were to use such a word, was not the downfall of another, but the quiet, steady, and unassailable construction of one's own well-ordered and meaningful existence. Isabella had sought to rewrite our shared history for her own benefit, to seize assets through a narrative of entitlement. She had underestimated the quiet man who dealt in facts, the forensic auditor who understood that the most powerful truths are those supported by irrefutable, meticulously documented evidence. In the end, the archive had spoken, and its voice had been clear, precise, and ultimately decisive. My personal ledger was balanced, my accounts in order, and the narrative of Samuel Croft, forensic financial auditor, retired, continued to be written, each new day a clean page, inscribed with the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with integrity, vigilance, and an enduring appreciation for the unshakable power of the well-kept record. The mortgage on my peace of mind had long been paid in full, and this time there were no surprise claims pending against the title. It was, and would remain, entirely my own.